My husband laughed at my 25th anniversary gift, calling my heart-carved sculpture expensive firewood. So I quietly sent it to a New York gallery. During his fancy dinner party, I took a call on speakerphone and announced it had just sold for $170,000. This is where the story truly begins, and you won't want to miss what happens. Make sure you're subscribed to see it through to the end. We're always curious. Where in the world are you all watching from today? Let us know in the comments. The silence in our pristine, minimalist living room was heavier than any sound could ever be. It was the kind of silence that presses down on you, squeezing the air from your lungs and making your ears ring. For 6 months, I had poured every spare moment, every ounce of my soul, into the block of reclaimed maple that now stood between my husband, Richard, and me. It was our 25th wedding anniversary, a milestone that felt both monumental and strangely hollow. My gift to him, the sculpture I had named the 25th year, was meant to fill that hollowness, to give shape and form to the quarter-century we had spent together. I had been feeling unwell for weeks, a persistent fatigue that clung to me like a damp coat, accompanied by a dull ache in my joints that made the physical act of sculpting a challenge. The doctor had been vague, mentioning autoimmune markers and ordering more tests, leaving me in a state of anxious limbo. But finishing this piece had given me a sense of purpose, a focal point beyond my own ailing body. I had pushed through the pain, my hands, though stiff and sore, moving with a certainty that came from a place deeper than muscle and bone. The sculpture was an abstract representation of a journey. It started from a gnarled, rough base, symbolizing our difficult early years, then twisted and soared upwards, smoothing into polished, interwoven spirals that represented our shared life, our 2 children, our triumphs. Near the top, a deliberate, hollowed-out space signified the losses we had endured, miscarriages, the passing of our parents. It wasn't just a piece of wood. It was a 3-dimensional diary of our marriage. I watched Richard's face, searching for a flicker of understanding, of emotion, of anything other than the cool, appraising look he usually reserved for a stock market ticker. He circled the sculpture slowly, his expensive Italian loafers silent on the polished oak floor. He was dressed in his usual weekend attire, a cashmere sweater and tailored slacks that cost more than my entire workshop of tools. He ran a manicured finger over a smooth curve, then tapped a rough edge near the base. The sound was a sharp, clinical rap that made me flinch. Finally, he stopped, standing directly in front of me, the sculpture a silent witness between us. He folded his arms, a small, humorless smile playing on his lips. "Well, Clara," he began, his voice laced with a familiar, weary condescension. "You've certainly been busy with your little hobby." I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. "It's for you, Richard, for us, it's our 25 years. He let out a short, sharp laugh. It wasn't a sound of mirth, it was a sound of dismissal. "Our 25 years? Darling, it's a piece of wood. A very large, very rustic piece of wood. What on earth are we supposed to do with this?" He gestured around our living room, a space curated by a high-priced interior designer to be a temple of beige and chrome. "Can you see this thing sitting next to the Brancusi print? It would be a joke." The air left my body in a painful rush. A joke. My work, my heart, my pain, my love, all carved into that maple, was a joke to him. I thought we could put it in the study," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He shook his head, his smile widening into a patronizing grin. "The study is for my deal trophies, you know that. Listen, I appreciate the effort." The word hung in the air, dripping with insincerity. "But honestly, what this looks like is some very expensive firewood. Maybe we can use it to start the bonfire at the firm's summer retreat. The junior associates would get a kick out of that." He winked, as if sharing a clever secret with me, as if we were on the same side. But we weren't. We were on opposite sides of a chasm that had just opened up at my feet. The fatigue I had been battling for months washed over me in a dizzying wave, and the ache in my joints sharpened into a fiery protest. I had to grip the back of a nearby armchair to steady myself. All the nights I had worked until my fingers were raw, all the mornings I had woken up sketching designs, all the passion I thought we still shared, at least in memory. It all turned to ash in my mouth. He seemed to notice my pallor, but he misinterpreted its cause. "Oh, don't be so dramatic, Clara. It's fine. It's a sweet gesture." He walked over to the sleek, minimalist sideboard and picked up a small, velvet-wrapped box. "Now for a real gift." He handed it to me. My hands were trembling so much I could barely open it. Inside, nestled on a bed of satin, was a diamond tennis bracelet. It was cold, heavy, and utterly impersonal. It was the kind of gift a man gives when he has outsourced the task to his personal assistant with a budget and a deadline. It was beautiful, flawless, and meant absolutely nothing. It was an apology for not paying attention, a placeholder for genuine affection. I looked from the glittering, lifeless diamonds on my wrist to the living, breathing story of the sculpture across the room. I looked at my husband, a man I had loved for more than half my life, who saw my soul and valued it as firewood. The physical pain from my mysterious illness was a dull throb compared to the sharp, piercing agony in my chest. The betrayal was worse than the diagnosis itself. The morning after the anniversary was thick with an unspoken tension. Richard acted as if nothing had happened, as if his words had been light and harmless, destined to evaporate with the morning dew. He sat at the head of our long, sterile dining table, scrolling through financial news on his tablet, a porcelain cup of black coffee steaming at his elbow. The diamond bracelet he had given me sat on the table between us, a glittering barrier. I hadn't been able to bring myself to wear it. He gestured towards it with a flick of his wrist, not looking up from his screen. "You should put that in the safe, Clara. It's insured, of course, but there's no sense in leaving it out." His tone was practical, devoid of sentiment. He wasn't asking why I wasn't wearing his gift, he was simply managing an asset. The sculpture, my gift, was still in the living room, a hulking, silent accusation that he pointedly ignored. We had housekeepers who came twice a week, and I knew that if I didn't move it, he would eventually instruct them to haul it down to the basement, or worse, out to the garage with the discarded exercise equipment and old paint cans. "I haven't decided where to put it yet," I said, my voice flat. My body ached profoundly this morning, a deep-seated weariness that made even lifting my own coffee cup feel like a monumental effort. The stress had aggravated my symptoms, turning the dull ache into a network of sharp, throbbing pains. "Well, decide soon," he said, still focused on his tablet. "My partner, Jonathan, and his wife are coming for dinner on Saturday. I don't want them thinking we've suddenly developed an interest in rustic lawn ornaments." Each word was a small, calculated jab. He knew he had hurt me, and this was his way of doubling down, of asserting that his reality, a world of polished surfaces and monetary value, was the only one that mattered. My reality, one of emotion and creation and intangible worth, was a foolish indulgence. Later that day, I was sitting in my workshop in the converted sunroom at the back of the house, staring at my idle tools. The scent of cedar and maple usually calmed me, but today it just reminded me of my failure. My phone buzzed on the workbench. It was Isabel. "Happy anniversary, darling," her voice chirped, warm and full of life. I was going to call yesterday, but I didn't want to interrupt the festivities. How did Richard like his surprise? Was he absolutely floored? Isabel was my oldest friend. We had met in a pottery class in college, back when I still believed I could have a life as an artist. She had gone on to pursue that dream, and now owned a small but highly respected contemporary art gallery in Soho. I, on the other hand, had met Richard, an ambitious business student who had convinced me that a life in the arts was a life of poverty and instability. I chose security. I chose him. Tears pricked my eyes. I couldn't lie to her. He hated it, Izzy. He called it firewood. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. Then, he what? That man wouldn't know a masterpiece if it fell on his perfectly coiffed head. "Clara, don't you dare listen to him. He's an investment banker. His soul is a spreadsheet." I tried to laugh, but it came out as a choked sob. "It's just, I put so much of myself into it, and he just dismissed it. He dismissed me." "I'm coming over," she said, her voice firm. "Don't move. And for heaven's sake, don't you dare move that sculpture to the basement. I want to see it. An hour later, Isabel stood in my living room, her hands clasped in front of her eyes wide with something that looked like reverence. She was the opposite of Richard in every way. Where he was cool and restrained, she was vibrant and expressive, dressed in a flowing silk tunic and chunky turquoise jewelry. She walked around the sculpture, not with Richard's clinical appraisal, but with an artist's eye, taking in the lines, the textures, the story it told. "Clara," she breathed, finally turning to me, "this is breathtaking, the emotional narrative, the craftsmanship, the way you've handled the grain to express both struggle and grace. It's the best work you've ever done. It's museum quality." Her words were a soothing balm on my wounded spirit. She saw what I saw. She understood. "Richard wants to use it for a bonfire," I said, the words still tasting bitter. Isabel's eyes flashed with fury. "Over my dead body, he doesn't deserve this. He doesn't deserve you." She looked at me, her expression softening as she took in my pale face and the weary slump of my shoulders. "You look tired, honey. Is everything okay?" I waved a hand dismissively, not wanting to burden her with my health worries on top of everything else. "Just a bit run down. It's been a long few months finishing this." She didn't press, but her gaze was sharp with concern. She turned back to the sculpture, a determined glint in her eye. "This piece doesn't belong here, Clara. It doesn't belong in a house where it's not cherished. It needs to be seen. It needs to be celebrated." A seed of an idea began to sprout in my mind, a tiny, rebellious shoot pushing up through the barren soil of my despair. I looked at the sculpture, my creation, my story. Then I looked at the diamond bracelet, still sitting on the dining room table, a cold and shiny monument to my husband's ignorance. Richard saw value only in things that came with a price tag from a reputable jeweler or a well-known auction house. He understood prestige, not passion. And as I looked at the beautiful, powerful work my own hands had made, a quiet thought echoed in my mind. But they had forgotten one crucial thing. He had forgotten who I was before I became his wife. Richard wasn't always so dismissive. Or perhaps he was, and I had simply chosen not to see it, blinded by the dazzling future he painted for us. When we met, I was a scholarship art student with clay under my fingernails and dreams of a kiln of my own. He was the star of the business school, exuding a confidence that bordered on arrogance, but which I mistook for strength. He spoke of 5-year plans and stock portfolios with a passion I reserved for glazes and form. He called my art my cute little hobby even then, but it was said with an indulgent smile, as if it were a charming quirk he was fond of. He convinced me that his path was the one that would provide us with a beautiful life. "You can have a studio in any house I buy for you, darling," he'd promised. "You won't have to worry about selling a single pot to pay the bills." It sounded like a dream, the freedom to create without the pressure to survive. In reality, it became a gilded cage. Over the years, my art became the thing I squeezed into the margins of my life. My primary role was to be Mrs. Richard Sterling, the perfect corporate wife. I hosted dinner parties for his clients, my own creativity channeled into selecting the right canapés and flower arrangements. I managed our homes, our children's schedules, our social calendar. I was the silent, supportive partner behind his meteoric rise at the investment firm. I attended charity galas, smiling graciously as he accepted accolades for his financial acumen and philanthropic generosity. Generosity that often involved him donating a significant sum in exchange for having his name carved onto a plaque. He was a master of transactional relationships. For our 10th anniversary, I had spent a month creating a complex ceramic vase, its surface covered in intricate carvings that depicted scenes from our first decade together. He thanked me politely and put it in a guest room, where it was eventually knocked over and broken by a careless housekeeper. He hadn't seemed to notice its absence for 6 months. For our 20th, I had painted a large abstract canvas, a swirl of the blues and grays that represented the calm stability we had found after the chaotic years of raising children. He had it moved to his office, but I later found out from his secretary that he had replaced it with a framed, oversized photograph of himself shaking hands with a minor European royal. Each dismissal was a small cut, but 25 years of them had left a latticework of scars on my soul. I had sacrificed my own ambitions for his, believing that our partnership was a joint enterprise. But I had slowly come to realize that in Richard's eyes, I was not a partner. I was an accessory. A well-managed, reliable part of his portfolio, like our real estate holdings or our blue-chip stocks. My value was in how well I reflected his success. This sculpture was supposed to be different. It was my quiet rebellion, my attempt to create something so significant, so undeniably powerful, that he would have no choice but to finally see me. The artist. The woman I was before I became his wife. The failure of that attempt was what had broken me. His mockery of the 25th year wasn't just an insult to a piece of art. It was the final, definitive rejection of the person I truly was. Richard's world was built on a very specific and rigid definition of value. He was a man who lived and breathed status. Our car was a German luxury sedan, not because it was a superior machine, but because it broadcast a message of wealth and discernment. Our vacations were to exclusive resorts frequented by the global elite. He didn't read books. He collected first editions that sat unread on shelves. His entire life was a performance for an unseen audience of rivals and peers. His appearance was as meticulously curated as his stock portfolio. He was tall and handsome, with silvering hair he kept perfectly styled and a wardrobe of bespoke suits. He had a disarming smile he could switch on in a boardroom or a ballroom, but at home, that smile rarely reached his eyes. His praise was always qualified, his affection transactional. He would compliment my dress before a corporate event, but it was always followed by a subtle critique. "That color is striking on you, Clara, though perhaps a simpler necklace next time. We don't want to look ostentatious." He treated our children the same way. When our son, Alex, wanted to be a history teacher, Richard had scoffed. "A teacher? Don't be ridiculous. You'll go into finance like me. There's no prestige in chalk dust." He only relented when Alex agreed to pursue a PhD at an Ivy League university, a credential that Richard could at least boast about at dinner parties. When our daughter, Chloe, became a pediatric nurse, he referred to her as the one who works at the hospital, as if it were a slightly embarrassing community service project. He was the polished, disingenuous antagonist of my life. His manipulations were not loud or aggressive, they were quiet, insidious cuts. He was an expert at making me feel small, foolish, and impractical. My passion for art was, in his view, a liability to the perfect image he had constructed for our family. It was messy, emotional, and worst of all, it had no clear monetary value. It didn't fit on his spreadsheet, and what Richard couldn't quantify, he couldn't respect. The sculpture was the ultimate embodiment of everything about me he could not control or understand. And so his only recourse was to mock it, to shrink it down to something so insignificant that it posed no threat to his ordered world. Isabel's visit was the catalyst. Seeing my work through her eyes, hearing her professional validation, relit a pilot light inside me that I thought had long been extinguished. For the first time in days, the suffocating fog of fatigue and despair began to lift, replaced by a fragile spark of anger. Anger, I realized, was a much more productive emotion than sorrow. "You're right," I said to her, my voice stronger than it had been all week. "It doesn't belong here." "Damn right it doesn't," she said, pacing in front of the sculpture. "Clara, there's a juried exhibition I'm involved with, Emerging Voices. It's for artists who are considered undiscovered, regardless of age. It's held at a very prestigious gallery on Fifth Avenue. The submission deadline is Friday." My heart gave a nervous flutter. "Oh, Izzy, I couldn't. I'm just a hobbyist. My work wouldn't stand a chance against professionally trained artists." Isabel stopped pacing and grabbed my hands. Her grip was firm, her eyes blazing. "Stop it. Stop repeating the nonsense that man has been whispering in your ear for 25 years. You are not a hobbyist. You are an artist, a damn good one. And this piece," she gestured to the sculpture, "is your voice, loud and clear. It deserves to be heard." The idea was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. To take my most personal creation, the one born from my pain and my history, the one my own husband had ridiculed, and send it out into the world to be judged, it felt like the ultimate act of defiance. It was a way to reclaim a part of myself that I had allowed to be buried for far too long. This was my clever trap. Not a trap for Richard, necessarily, but for myself, a way to force myself out of the box he had built around me. What would I have to do? I asked, the words tasting of freedom. Isabel grinned, sensing victory. I'll handle everything. I'll get a professional photographer here tomorrow to take the submission photos. We'll write the artist's statement together. We'll list my gallery as the point of contact, so no mail or emails will come to the house. Richard will never have to know. Think of it, Clara, your work on Fifth Avenue. The plan shifted me from a passive victim into an active strategist. The investigation wasn't about uncovering a crime, but about uncovering my own potential. The next day, while Richard was at his office trading futures and managing millions, my house was quietly transformed. A young, respectful photographer spent 2 hours capturing every angle of the 25th year, treating it with the reverence of a holy relic. He and Isabel discussed lighting and shadow in hushed tones, while I watched, a thrill running through me. That afternoon, Isabel and I sat at my kitchen table, crafting the artist's statement. For the first time, I put the story of the sculpture into words. I wrote about the passage of time, about the beauty and imperfection, about the resilience of love and the scars it can leave behind. I wrote everything except the painful truth of its rejection. I gave the piece the dignity my husband had denied it. The most difficult part was arranging for the shipping. If selected, the piece would have to be professionally crated and transported to New York. It was a significant expense, one that would be impossible to hide from the joint accounts Richard monitored so closely. This is where my own secret leverage came into play. Years ago, my grandmother had left me a small inheritance, a portfolio of stocks she had bought in the 1960s. She had insisted it be kept in an account under my name only. Every woman needs a little go-to-hell money, she had told me, a mischievous twinkle in her eye. I had never touched it, but I had watched it grow steadily over the decades. It was my safety net, my secret stash of independence. I called my broker and liquidated a small portion of the shares. The transaction was seamless and, more importantly, invisible to Richard. I hired the best art handlers in the city, the same ones used by the local museum. The day they came, my heart was in my throat. Richard was playing golf with a client. The two men, dressed in clean white overalls, moved with practiced efficiency, building a custom crate around my sculpture in the living room. It felt surreal, watching this piece of my soul being packaged up like a precious artifact. As they loaded it onto the truck, I felt a pang of fear, but it was quickly overshadowed by a profound sense of empowerment. I was taking action. I was betting on myself. For the next few weeks, life returned to a semblance of normal, but something inside me had fundamentally changed. The house felt different without the sculpture's presence. The living room seemed larger, emptier, the silence no longer accusatory but expectant. I found myself humming as I worked in my studio, sketching new ideas, feeling a creative energy I hadn't felt in years. The physical pain in my joints hadn't vanished, but it seemed to have lessened its grip, as if my body was responding to the hope my spirit had found. My secret knowledge was a shield. When Richard made a casually cutting remark or ignored me in favor of his work, it didn't pierce me as it once had. I would just smile to myself and think, he has no idea. He still saw me as the dutiful, artless wife. He had forgotten one crucial thing: I had a voice, and I had just sent it to New York. The notification came 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning. It was an email from the exhibition coordinator, sent to the address I had set up specifically for my art, an address forwarded to Isabel's gallery. She called me the moment she read it. "You're in, Clara, you're in," she shrieked into the phone, her voice electric with excitement. They loved it. The jury was unanimous. They said it was a work of profound emotional honesty and technical brilliance. Unanimous. I sank onto a stool in my workshop, my legs suddenly weak. A wave of dizziness, this time born of joy and not illness, washed over me. I don't believe it. Believe it, my friend, you are officially an exhibited artist. And that's not all. I could hear the smile in her voice. They want to make it a featured piece for the opening night charity auction. They think it could be the star of the show. An auction, my sculpture, being sold. The idea was so foreign, so far beyond the scope of anything I had ever imagined that I couldn't process it. People would pay for it. Pay for it? Clara, they're going to fight over it. Now we need to set a reserve price. The gallery suggests a baseline, but the final decision is yours. We spent the next hour discussing logistics, numbers, and possibilities that made my head spin. When I hung up, I felt like I was floating. The world looked sharper, the colors more vivid. I had been validated, not by my husband, but by people who mattered, people who understood. My secret had blossomed from a seed of defiance into a beautiful, tangible reality. This newfound confidence began to subtly alter my behavior at home. I spent more time in my studio, not as an escape, but as a place of legitimate work. I started buying higher quality supplies, investing in myself and my craft with the money from my grandmother's inheritance. Richard, ever observant when it came to finances, noticed the uptick in spending. One evening, he came into my studio holding a credit card statement. He didn't look angry, merely puzzled, as if trying to solve a minor accounting error. "Clara, there's a charge here for $500 from an art supply store," he said, holding the paper out to me. "And another for a specialt. Why would supplier in Oregon? Is everything all right? Are you planning to build an ark?" A few months ago, this question would have made me shrink. I would have stammered an apology, justified myself, and promised to be more careful. But now, I simply wiped my dusty hands on my apron and met his gaze. "I needed some new materials," I said calmly. "I'm starting a new project." He frowned, his eyes scanning the studio. "Another one? What happened to the big one, the firewood?" I felt a flash of the old hurt, but I didn't let it show. This was the first confrontation, however small. My reaction mattered. "I had it moved," I said, my voice even. "Moved where? To the garage? Good. It was taking up half the living room." "No," I said, enjoying the moment of quiet power. "I sent it away." He finally gave me his full attention, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. He hated not being privy to every detail, not being in control. "Sent it where? What are you talking about?" This was the reveal. Not the full reveal, but the first crack in the facade of his ignorance. I strategically revealed a key piece of information, a hint of the new reality I was building for myself. "A friend of mine was interested in it," I said, choosing my words carefully. It wasn't a lie. Isabel was more than interested. She took it to have it appraised. Richard's reaction was exactly what I expected. He laughed. It was the same dismissive, condescending laugh he had used on our anniversary. "Appraised? Darling, who is going to appraise a block of wood you carved in the sunroom? Your friend from the pottery class." He was trying to belittle me, to put me back in my box. "What's she going to value it at? A cord of oak? Be serious." His poorly executed threats were not about violence, but about my intelligence and sanity. He was implying I was a fool being taken for a ride, a silly woman with delusions of grandeur. It was his classic tactic: infantilize and dismiss. But this time, it didn't work. The insult slid right off the armor of my secret knowledge. His predictable condescension only served to confirm the righteousness of my actions. He was so blinded by his own arrogance that he couldn't imagine a world where I, his wife, could create something of actual value without his guidance or approval. I just smiled, a small, enigmatic smile that I knew would infuriate him. "We'll see," I said softly. "You never know what things are worth." I turned back to the piece of cherry wood on my workbench, picking up a chisel. The conversation was over. I had won this small skirmish, not by arguing or defending myself, but by simply refusing to accept his definition of reality. I let him stand there for a moment, baffled by my newfound calm, by his inability to get a rise out of me. The dynamic between us had shifted. I was no longer just the creator of his so-called firewood. I was the keeper of a secret, and that secret was my strength. The weeks leading up to the gallery opening were a strange dance of dual realities. In my secret life, I was in constant communication with Isabel. The gallery had produced a stunning catalog for the exhibition, and a full-page photo of the 25th year was featured prominently. They had promoted the auction heavily to their exclusive list of collectors, and Isabel reported that there was already significant buzz around my piece. The stakes were escalating with every passing day. The gallery owner had taken Isabel and me to lunch via video call, a formidable woman with sharp eyes and a sharper intuition for art. She told me my sculpture had a haunting power and predicted it would be the highlight of the night. Meanwhile, in my life with Richard, I was playing the part of the dutiful wife. His big dinner party, the one to celebrate his partner Jonathan's promotion, was fast approaching. Richard was obsessed with it. Everything had to be perfect. The caterer, the wine pairings, the guest list. He was in performance mode, and he expected me to be his co-star. His dismissiveness continued, but it was now tinged with a new note of irritation. My serene confidence was unsettling to him. He was like a man trying to use a key on a lock that had been changed. He tried to provoke me, to draw me into the familiar arguments where he always had the upper hand. "I saw another charge for that art nonsense," he said one evening, tossing an envelope onto the kitchen island. "Are you planning on opening your own lumber yard?" I didn't even look up from the cookbook I was reading. "It's my money, Richard. I can do what I like with it." This was new. I had never spoken to him about my inheritance that way. It had always been an unspoken, untouched entity. My assertion of ownership clearly threw him. "It's our money," he corrected, his voice tight. "Everything in this house, in our lives, is ours." "My grandmother left it to me, and me alone," I said, finally meeting his gaze, my own cool and steady. "And I've decided to invest some of it in my own interests." He stared at me, his jaw clenched. He was losing control, and he didn't know why. He couldn't comprehend that my rebellion wasn't about money, it was about self-worth, a concept that didn't appear on any of his financial statements. The case against him was building, not in a legal sense, but in an emotional one. Every condescending remark, every dismissive gesture, was another piece of irrefutable proof that the man I had married saw me as a subordinate, not a partner. Isabel, my fierce ally, provided the external validation I needed. She forwarded me an email from a prominent art critic who had seen a preview of the show and had specifically requested to know more about the brilliant sculptor, C. Sterling. The name, C. Sterling, was the one we had used for the submission. It was a small act of camouflage, just enough to keep it from being immediately recognizable to anyone in our social circle who might stumble upon it. The evening of the gallery opening in New York was also the evening of Richard's dinner party at our home. The timing was almost poetic. As I was arranging flowers and ensuring the caterers had everything they needed, my phone was buzzing in my pocket with updates from Isabel, who was at the gallery. "It's a full house, Clara. People are flocking to your sculpture. They're reading the artist's statement. They're moved. I've heard the word masterpiece at least 5 times. My hands trembled as I adjusted a centerpiece. Richard walked into the dining room, straightening his tie. "You look a bit pale, Clara," he observed, not with concern but with criticism. "Do try to look cheerful tonight. Jonathan's wife is a dreadful bore, but he's crucial to my next bonus. I need you to be charming." I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him that at that very moment, hundreds of miles away, my soul was on display and people were calling it a masterpiece. I wanted to tell him that his world of bonuses and boring wives was a tiny, insignificant speck compared to the universe of emotion and creation he so casually mocked. But I held my tongue. The final confrontation was coming. The stage was set, not in a Fifth Avenue gallery, but here, in our own dining room, the heart of the life he had built and I had decorated. The guests arrived, a parade of expensive suits and glittering jewelry. The air filled with the sound of polite laughter and conversations about stock markets, tropical vacations, and boarding schools. I played my part, smiling and fetching drinks, the perfect hostess. Richard was in his element, holding court, telling an anecdote about a hostile takeover. At one point, Jonathan's wife, a kind but timid woman named Mary, complimented a small painting I had done years ago that hung in the hallway. "Oh, Clara, that's beautiful. You're so talented," she said. Richard overheard and swaggered over, putting an arm around my shoulder. His touch felt heavy and proprietary. "Oh, that's just Clara's little hobby," he said to the group, his voice booming with false affection. "She likes to dabble. She recently made this enormous wooden thing. I told her we should use it for firewood. Can you imagine?" The group chuckled politely. My face burned with humiliation. It was the ultimate public dismissal. He hadn't just insulted me in private. He was using my passion as a punchline to entertain his colleagues. He was building his own case, providing the final, irrefutable proof of his contempt. In his desperation to reassert his dominance, he had handed me the perfect opening. My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was Isabel. The auction was about to begin. The main course had just been cleared. The guests were nursing glasses of expensive port, the low hum of conversation filling the dining room. Richard, flushed with wine and success, was at the head of the table, pontificating on the future of the market. He was in his element, the king in his castle, surrounded by his court. I sat at the opposite end, a smiling, silent queen. But beneath my placid exterior, my heart was hammering against my ribs. My phone, which I had placed on my lap, vibrated again. A text from Isabel. "It's starting. Bidding is opening at $25,000. I felt a wave of nausea. $25,000. It was an astronomical sum, more than I had ever dreamed. I typed a shaky reply, "Keep me posted." Richard was now telling a story about a disastrous golf game, embellishing the details for comedic effect. He glanced down the table at me, a slight smirk on his face, as if to say, "See, this is how it's done. This is real entertainment." He still thought my silence was submission. My phone buzzed again. "It's at $50K. 2 phone bidders are fighting over it." I took a sharp, quiet breath. I felt lightheaded. 50,000. I looked around the table at these people who measured success in quarterly earnings and the size of their vacation homes. They lived in a world of concrete numbers, and suddenly I had a number of my own. Jonathan, Richard's partner, turned to me. "Richard tells us you're a sculptor, Clara. That must be a fascinating way to spend your time." His tone was polite, but his eyes had the same vaguely dismissive glaze as his wife's. Before I could answer, Richard cut in, laughing. "She's a wood chipper, is what she is. I keep telling her she's missing her calling. She could save us a fortune on landscaping." More polite chuckles. My hand tightened around my phone in my lap. Another buzz, 80K. A new bidder just entered, someone in the room. My gaze drifted to the empty space in the living room, visible from the dining area where the sculpture used to stand. It had commanded that space. Now, its absence was a tangible presence, a ghost of my own making. My phone buzzed one more time, a long, insistent vibration. It was a call. Isabel. This was it. The moment had arrived. With a calmness that I did not feel, I stood up. All eyes turned to me. A wife rarely interrupts her husband when he is holding court. "Richard, darling," I said, my voice clear and steady, cutting through his anecdote. "Forgive me for interrupting." He looked at me annoyed. "Clara, I was in the middle of a story." "I know," I said, holding up my phone. "But this is rather important. It's a call from New York." I pressed the button to accept the call and then the one to put it on speakerphone. The entire table fell silent, their curiosity piqued. "Clara, can you hear me?" Isabel's voice, crackling with an energy that seemed to suck all the air out of the room, filled the silence. "We can hear you perfectly, Isabel," I said, my eyes locked on Richard. His face was a mask of confusion and irritation. "Oh my God, Clara, you are not going to believe this," Isabel yelled, oblivious to her audience. There was a din of noise behind her, applause, excited chatter. "It's over. The bidding war was insane. Two collectors were going back and forth, but then a representative from the Museum of Modern Art Acquisitions board stepped in at the last second. It's over. A hush fell over the dining table. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick Persian rug. "How did it do, Izzy?" I asked, my voice trembling ever so slightly. Isabel let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. $170,000, Clara. Your sculpture, the firewood, just sold for $170,000, to be acquired by Moeme. Can you believe it? The words hung in the air, shimmering and lethal. $170,000. I watched as every drop of color drained from Richard's face. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. His smug, confident expression collapsed like a building being demolished, replaced by a look of pure, slack-jawed shock. His eyes, wide and unblinking, were fixed on me. They held not just surprise, but a dawning, horrified understanding. The guests were frozen, their wine glasses paused halfway to their lips. Jonathan's jaw was practically on the table. His wife, Mary, was staring at me with a newfound respect that was almost comical. In that one moment, everything changed. I was no longer Clara, the hobbyist wife. I was C. Sterling, the artist. The woman whose work, whose very soul, had just been valued by the world at a number even Richard couldn't ignore. The public humiliation was absolute. He had used my art as a punchline in front of these people, and I had just used it to deliver a punchline of my own, one that had knocked him flat. I smiled, a genuine, triumphant smile. I looked directly at my pale, speechless husband, the man who had tried to shrink me down to the size of his own limited imagination. "Firewood, you said?" I asked, my voice soft but carrying to every corner of the silent room. "I suppose we should have saved a piece. It seems to be worth quite a bit." I then raised my phone to my ear, turning off the speaker. "Izzy," I said, my voice filled with a joy so pure it felt like flying. "Let's talk tomorrow. I have a party to finish." The dinner party ended abruptly. The guests, sensing the seismic shift in the room's atmosphere, made their excuses and departed with an awkward haste, leaving a trail of half-finished drinks and bewildered apologies. Richard remained at the head of the table, silent and ashen, looking like a king whose throne had just been publicly dismantled. When the last car had pulled away, I walked back into the dining room. The silence that returned was different from the one that had started this journey. It was no longer heavy with my unspoken pain. It was light with his stunning defeat. He finally looked at me, his eyes filled with a cocktail of emotions I had never seen there before. Confusion, humiliation, and a sliver of what might have been fear. "Clara, I don't understand," he stammered. "Moeme, 170,000. How?" "I submitted it too." "An exhibition, Richard," I said simply, beginning to clear the plates. The domesticity of the act felt grounding after the high drama of the evening. "The one you called expensive firewood. They called it a masterpiece." "You did this behind my back?" he asked, the question laced with accusation, a desperate attempt to frame me as the one who had committed a betrayal. I stopped and faced him, my hands on my hips. "Did what? Believed in myself? Refused to let your mockery be the final word on my worth? Yes, I did that behind your back. Because I knew, if I did it in front of you, you would have crushed it before it ever had a chance to grow." His shoulders slumped. The arrogance that had been his armor for decades was gone, leaving him looking smaller, older. "I had no idea. I thought it was just a hobby." "It was never just a hobby," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "It was my passion. It was my voice. You just chose not to listen." In the days that followed, Richard was a ghost in our own home. He tried to apologize, but his words were clumsy and misplaced. He talked about the money, about the prestige. "We're rich, Clara. Moeme, my partners will be stunned." He still didn't get it. He was trying to absorb my victory into his own narrative of success, to claim it as a shared asset. But it wasn't his, it was mine. I used my professional network, Isabel's network, which was now my own, to ensure justice was fully served. I hired a top intellectual property lawyer, recommended by the gallery, to handle the museum contract and manage the flood of new inquiries that were coming in. I took a portion of the money from the sale, combined it with the rest of my grandmother's inheritance, and bought a small commercial property in the city's arts district. It had high ceilings and incredible natural light. It was the studio I had dreamed of since I was a girl. The reconciliation Richard hoped for never came, not in the way he imagined. He wanted us to go back to the way things were, only now with him as the proud husband of a famous artist. But I couldn't go back. The woman who had been his wife for 25 years no longer existed. She had been carved away, piece by piece, by his dismissiveness, and the artist underneath had finally been set free. Our last meaningful conversation took place in the empty living room a month later, as I was directing movers. "You're really leaving?" he asked, his voice hollow. "I'm not leaving you, Richard," I said, and it was the truth. "I'm moving toward myself. I'm going to my new life, my new studio. You are welcome to visit me there, but you will be visiting me on my terms, in my space." His downfall was not financial or legal, but deeply personal. He was left alone in his pristine, minimalist house, surrounded by objects whose value he understood, but whose meaning he had never grasped. His social standing took a hit. The story of the dinner party spread like wildfire through our circle, painting him as a fool who couldn't recognize the genius sleeping next to him. My story, however, was just beginning. The sale of the 25th year opened every door. I was offered a solo exhibition, then another. I was profiled in art magazines, but the greatest triumph was not the fame or the money. It was the quiet peace I felt standing in my own studio, the scent of wood shavings in the air, my hands, still aching but now strong and sure, shaping a new piece from a raw block of walnut. Richard and I are separated. He is in therapy, trying to understand a world that is not governed by balance sheets. Perhaps one day he will. Perhaps one day we will find a new way to be in each other's lives, one based on mutual respect. But I am not waiting for that day. My reconciliation was not with him, but with myself. I had finally forgiven the young woman who had put her dreams on a shelf, and I had embraced the artist who had been waiting so patiently to be seen. The vindication was not in the price tag of my art, but in the priceless feeling of my own, unshakable worth.